A black waitress named Marjorie is fired from a luxury hotel restaurant without cause. 6 months later, she returns in an unexpected way. As her rapid rise to the top leaves the woman who dismissed her reeling, can Marjorie prove that sometimes the sweetest revenge is success? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Marjorie's heart raced with excitement as she tied her apron and smoothed her uniform. Tonight was no ordinary night at the Grand Plaza Hotel's restaurant. The air buzzed with anticipation, and even the chandeliers seemed to sparkle a little brighter. "Big night, Marjorie," called out Tom, a fellow waiter, as he rushed past with a tray of champagne flutes. Marjorie nodded, her eyes twinkling. I can hardly believe it, a real food critic. As she made her way through the dining room, Marjorie's warm smile greeted each guest. She had a knack for making everyone feel special, from the businessman dining alone to the family celebrating a birthday. "How's everything tasting?" she asked a couple, leaning in with genuine interest. "Absolutely divine," the woman gushed. "You always make our visits so wonderful, Marjorie." Marjorie's cheeks flushed with pleasure. "Oh, that's so kind of you to say. I'm just happy you're enjoying yourselves." As she headed back to the kitchen, Marjorie's gaze lingered on the busy chefs. She watched in awe as they twirled and danced around each other, creating culinary masterpieces. Her heart ached with longing. One day, she promised herself, one day that would be her. The kitchen doors swung open and the junior head chef's voice boomed out. "Everyone on high alert! The critic could be here any minute." Marjorie's pulse quickened. She'd been waiting for this moment for weeks. It wasn't just about impressing the critic. It was a chance to show everyone, including herself, what she was capable of. As she carried a tray of appetizers, Marjorie's mind wandered to her own culinary creations. Last night, she'd experimented with a fusion of her grandmother's recipes and modern techniques. The memory of those flavors danced on her tongue and she couldn't help but smile. "Earth to Marjorie!" Tom's voice snapped her back to reality. "Table 7 needs more water." "On it!" Marjorie called back, her cheeks flushing. She couldn't let her daydreams distract her. Not tonight. As the evening progressed, Marjorie moved with grace and efficiency. She anticipated needs before they arose, making sure every guest felt like royalty. All the while, her eyes scanned the room, wondering which diner might be the mysterious critic. In a quiet moment, Marjorie found herself near the kitchen again. The tantalizing aromas wafting through the air made her close her eyes in bliss. She could almost taste the perfectly seared steak, the velvety sauce, the... "Marjorie?" The junior head chef's voice startled her. "Everything okay out there?" Marjorie's eyes flew open. "Yes, chef. It's going wonderfully. The guests are loving every bite." The chef nodded, a rare smile crossing his face. "Good work tonight, Marjorie. Keep it up." As he disappeared back into the kitchen, Marjorie's heart soared. Maybe, just maybe, her dreams weren't as far out of reach as she thought. As the evening wore on, Marjorie's excitement grew. She meticulously arranged the critic's table, making sure every detail was perfect. The crisp white tablecloth was smooth, the silverware gleamed, and the centerpiece was a vision of elegance. "It has to be just right," Marjorie whispered to herself, adjusting a fork ever so slightly. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Pots clanged, and voices rose above the sizzle of pans. At the center of it all stood Lucilia, the new head chef and new owner, her face flushed and her eyes darting from station to station. "Where are those garnishes?" Lucilia snapped at a sous chef. "And someone check on that sauce." Marjorie poked her head through the kitchen doors, sensing the stress. "Is everything okay, chef? Can I help with anything?" Lucilia's eyes narrowed. "Just do your job, Marjorie. We've got this under control." Nodding quickly, Marjorie retreated to the dining room. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but she pushed it aside and focused on her tasks. As the critic's arrival time drew near, Marjorie noticed a table looking impatient. She hurried to the kitchen to check on their order. "Table 12's entrees?" she asked politely. "It's coming," Lucilia barked. her hands shaking slightly as she plated a dish. Marjorie bit her lip, worried. She'd never seen the kitchen this far behind before. Just then, a commotion near the stove caught everyone's attention. A pot had boiled over, sending a wave of panic through the staff. In the chaos that followed, Marjorie's presence seemed to be the last straw for Lucilia. The chef whirled around, her face contorted with anger. "This is all your fault," Lucilia shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Marjorie. "You're always hovering, always distracting my staff." Marjorie's eyes widened in shock. I'm sorry, chef. I was just trying to help." "Help?" Lucilia's voice dripped with sarcasm. "You're nothing but a waitress. Stop pretending you belong in this kitchen." The harsh words echoed in the suddenly silent room. Marjorie felt as if she'd been slapped. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Chef, please," Marjorie said softly, her voice quavering. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I care about this restaurant as much as anyone." But Lucilia wasn't finished. Her face red with fury, she stepped closer to Marjorie. "You care? You're ruining everything. Get out of my kitchen. Now." Marjorie stood frozen, her heart pounding. She looked around at her co-workers, hoping someone would speak up, but they all averted their eyes. The unfairness of it all made her chest ache. Lucilia's face contorted with rage as she glared at Marjorie. The kitchen fell silent, everyone holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "You know what?" Lucilia snarled, her voice dripping with venom. "You're fired. Pack your things and get out." Marjorie's heart dropped to her stomach. "Fired?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "But chef, Did I stutter?" Lucilia cut her off. "You're undermining everything we stand for here. I want you gone. Now." Tears welled up in Marjorie's eyes as the weight of Lucilia's words sank in. She looked around at her co-workers, hoping someone would speak up, but they all avoided her gaze, shuffling uncomfortably. With shaking hands, Marjorie untied her apron and hung it on a nearby hook. She walked to the staff room, feeling everyone's eyes on her back. As she gathered her belongings, the unfairness of it all hit her like a tidal wave. Years of hard work, of arriving early and staying late, of going above and beyond, all of it wiped away in an instant. Marjorie had poured her heart and soul into this job, dreaming of the day she'd be in the kitchen herself. Now those dreams lay shattered at her feet. She stuffed her things into her bag, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. The staff room door creaked open, and Marjorie looked up, hoping to see a friendly face. Instead, it was Lucilia, her expression cold and unforgiving. "Your final check will be mailed to you," Lucilia said flatly. "Don't bother asking for a reference." Marjorie nodded silently, unable to trust her voice. She slung her bag over her shoulder and walked out, head held high despite the humiliation burning in her chest. As she passed through the kitchen one last time, Marjorie caught glimpses of her co-workers' sympathetic faces. But no one said a word. No one stood up for her. The dining room, usually a place of comfort for Marjorie, now felt alien and hostile. She hurried through, avoiding eye contact with the customers she'd served so diligently over the years. Finally, Marjorie pushed through the hotel's grand front doors. The cool night air hit her face and she let out a shaky breath. She stood there for a moment, staring at the bustling city street before her. What now? The question echoed in her mind as she took her first uncertain steps away from the hotel. Years of stability had vanished in an instant, leaving Marjorie adrift and unsure of her future. As she walked down the sidewalk, the weight of her situation settled on her shoulders. Marjorie had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. Her dream of becoming a chef seemed further away than ever before. Next morning, Marjorie trudged up the stairs to her small apartment, each step feeling heavier than the last. As she fumbled with her keys, the events of the night replayed in her mind like a cruel movie. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, dropping her bag on the floor with a dull thud. The silence of her empty apartment pressed in on her. Marjorie leaned against the closed door, finally allowing the tears she'd been holding back to fall freely. She slid down to the floor, hugging her knees to her chest as sobs racked her body. "Why? she whispered to the empty room. Why did Lucilia hate me so much? Marjorie's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. She'd always been kind to Lucilia, always respectful. Sure, she'd dreamed of being in the kitchen herself one day, but she'd never let that interfere with her work. Had Lucilia somehow known about her ambitions? Had that threatened her? As her tears subsided, Marjorie's gaze fell on a framed photo on her bookshelf. It showed her on her first day at the hotel, beaming with pride in her crisp uniform. She remembered how excited she'd been, how full of hope for the future. 5 years, Marjorie murmured, her voice thick with emotion. 5 years of my life, gone just like that. She forced herself to stand, her legs shaky. Marjorie walked over to the photo and picked it up, running her fingers over the glass. The girl in the picture looked so different from how she felt now. Defeated, broken, lost. Marjorie set the photo face down on the shelf. Her dream of becoming a chef, once so vibrant and alive, now felt like a distant, foolish fantasy. Who was she kidding? If she couldn't even keep a job as a waitress, how could she ever hope to run a kitchen? She shuffled to her tiny kitchen, opening the fridge out of habit more than hunger. The sight of the leftovers she'd brought home from the hotel over the years made her stomach churn. Marjorie slammed the fridge door shut, unable to bear the reminder of what she'd lost. Exhausted and heartbroken, she collapsed onto her bed, not bothering to change out of her work clothes. As she stared at the ceiling, the reality of her situation began to sink in. She was jobless, with no references and a tarnished reputation in the industry she loved. What am I going to do now? Marjorie whispered into the darkness. The question hung in the air, unanswered and daunting. The next morning, Marjorie woke to the harsh buzzing of her phone. She groaned, reaching for it blindly, her eyes still puffy from crying. The screen showed an unfamiliar number. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but something made her answer. Hello? Her voice was hoarse from sleep and sorrow. Marjorie, dear, it's Mrs. Ellis. Marjorie sat up, suddenly alert. Mrs. Ellis was one of her favorite regulars at the hotel restaurant, a kind, elderly woman who always had a warm smile and a generous tip. Mrs. Ellis, how nice to hear from you, Marjorie said, trying to inject some cheer into her voice. I hope I'm not calling too early, dear. I heard about what happened at the restaurant. It's simply dreadful how they treated you. Marjorie's heart sank. Oh, you heard about that? Indeed, and I must say I'm appalled. You were always such a dedicated worker. Tears pricked at Marjorie's eyes. Thank you, Mrs. Ellis, that means a lot. There was a pause, and then Mrs. Ellis continued, her voice taking on an excited tone. Now listen carefully, dear. I have a proposition for you. A proposition? Marjorie echoed, confused. Yes, you see, I have some connections in the culinary world. There's an exclusive cooking competition coming up, and I'd like to sponsor your entry. Marjorie's breath caught in her throat. A cooking competition? But Mrs. Ellis, I'm not a chef. I was just a waitress. Nonsense, Mrs. Ellis said firmly. I've seen how you light up when you talk about food, and don't think I haven't noticed you studying those chefs in the kitchen. You have talent, Marjorie. This could be your chance to show it. Marjorie's mind whirled. A cooking competition? Her? The idea seemed absurd, and yet a tiny spark of hope flickered in her chest. I don't know what to say, Marjorie stammered. Say yes, Mrs. Ellis urged gently. What do you have to lose? You still have 6 months to prepare. Marjorie bit her lip, thinking of the empty fridge, the bills piling up, the crushing weight of her shattered dreams. Mrs. Ellis was right. What did she have to lose? Okay, Marjorie said softly. Then with more conviction, okay, yes, I'll do it. She could hear the smile in Mrs. Ellis's voice as she replied, Wonderful. I'll make all the arrangements. We'll show them what you're made of, Marjorie. As they said their goodbyes, Marjorie felt a warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time since her firing, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of her culinary dreams after all. Marjorie stood in her tiny kitchen, staring at the ingredients spread out before her. The call from Mrs. Ellis had lit a fire in her soul, and now she was ready to fan the flames. With a deep breath, she tied her apron and got to work. Days turned into weeks as Marjorie threw herself into preparing for the competition. Her modest apartment became a culinary laboratory, filled with the aromas of spices from around the world. She pored over cookbooks, watched countless cooking shows, and experimented tirelessly. One afternoon, as she stirred a pot of simmering curry, a memory flooded back to her. She recalled her grandmother's kitchen, filled with the scent of traditional Mexican dishes mixed with the American classics her mother loved. A smile spread across Marjorie's face as an idea took root. "That's it," she whispered to herself. "I'll create fusion dishes that tell my story." From that moment on, Marjorie's cooking took on a new life. She blended flavors from her Mexican heritage with American comfort food, creating unique combinations that danced on the tongue. A tamale pie with a cornbread crust, chipotle mac and cheese, cilantro lime chicken pot pie. Each dish was a piece of her heart, a reflection of her journey. As she worked, Marjorie felt her confidence growing. The kitchen, once just a place to prepare meals, became her sanctuary. Here, she wasn't the fired waitress. She was a chef in the making, crafting her own destiny. Marjorie's tiny apartment filled with the enticing aromas of her creations. Neighbors would stop by, drawn by the scents wafting from her kitchen. She'd invite them in, eager for feedback on her latest experiments. Their encouraging words and genuine enjoyment of her food fueled her passion even more. As the weeks passed, Marjorie noticed a change in herself. The sadness and self-doubt that had plagued her since her firing began to fade. In their place, a quiet determination took root. She still had moments of uncertainty, times when she wondered if she was good enough. But now, instead of letting those thoughts defeat her, she channeled them into her cooking. With each new recipe she mastered, each flavor combination she perfected, Marjorie's excitement for the future grew. The competition was no longer just a chance to prove herself. It was an opportunity to share her unique culinary voice with the world. After months of preparation, as the sun peeked over the horizon, Marjorie's alarm clock shattered the morning silence. She sat up, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and nerves. Today was the day. The culinary competition she had been preparing for months. With trembling hands, she got ready, carefully packing her knife set and a few special ingredients she couldn't do without. As she caught her reflection in the mirror, Marjorie took a deep breath. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. The competition hall was a hive of activity when Marjorie arrived. Chefs from all walks of life bustled about, setting up their stations and eyeing the competition. The air was thick with the scent of spices and the sound of sizzling pans. Marjorie made her way to her assigned station, her eyes wide as she took in the professional-grade equipment. It was a far cry from her tiny apartment kitchen, but she felt ready for the challenge. As she unpacked her tools, a familiar voice caught her attention. Marjorie's head snapped up, and her heart skipped a beat. There, just a few stations away, stood Lucilia. The sight of her former boss sent a jolt through Marjorie's system. Lucilia looked as polished and confident as ever, chatting with some of the other contestants. For a moment, Marjorie felt like that scared waitress again, shrinking under Lucilia's harsh words. But then Lucilia turned and their eyes met. Recognition flashed across Lucilia's face, quickly replaced by a cold, dismissive look. She turned away, pretending she hadn't seen Marjorie at all. The tension in the air was immediate and palpable. Marjorie's hands shook as she continued to unpack, her mind racing. She hadn't expected to see Lucilia here, hadn't prepared for this additional challenge. Around them, the other contestants continued their preparations, oblivious to the silent drama unfolding. But for Marjorie and Lucilia, the competition had suddenly taken on a new dimension. It was no longer just about proving their culinary skills. It was about facing their shared past. Marjorie took a deep breath, trying to center herself. She couldn't let Lucilia's presence throw her off. She had worked too hard, come too far to let old fears hold her back now. As the competition began, Marjorie took a deep breath and focused on her station. She couldn't let Lucilia's presence distract her from what really mattered, showcasing her culinary skills. With determined hands, she began preparing her signature fusion dish. The kitchen buzzed with activity as contestants chopped, sautéed, and plated their creations. Marjorie's fingers flew as she combined ingredients from different cultures, creating a harmony of flavors that was uniquely her own. The aroma of spices filled the air around her station, drawing curious glances from nearby competitors. As she worked, Marjorie felt a sense of calm wash over her. This was what she was meant to do. Each knife cut, each stir of the pan felt like coming home. She poured her heart into every step of the process, letting her passion shine through in her cooking. Across the room, Lucilia worked with practiced precision, her movements crisp and efficient. But as the competition progressed, she found herself stealing glances at Marjorie's station. The creativity and ease with which her former employee worked surprised her. Lucilia's brow furrowed as she turned back to her own dish, a classic French recipe she had perfected over years. When it came time for judging, Marjorie presented her dish with a mixture of nervousness and pride. The judges' eyes widened as they tasted her creation. They praised the bold flavors and innovative combination of ingredients. Marjorie's heart soared at their words, a smile spreading across her face. "This is unlike anything we've tasted before," one judge commented, clearly impressed. "You've managed to bring together different culinary traditions in a way that feels fresh and exciting." As the judges moved on, Marjorie caught sight of Lucilia. Her former boss's face was a mix of shock and something else. Was it admiration? But before Marjorie could ponder it further, Lucilia quickly looked away, her jaw set in a hard line. As the first round concluded, it was clear that Marjorie had made an impression. Contestants and spectators alike were buzzing about her unique approach. For the first time since she'd been fired, Marjorie felt a surge of confidence. She belonged here among these talented chefs. Lucilia, on the other hand, was struggling to maintain her composure. Her dish, while technically perfect, hadn't sparked the same excitement as Marjorie's. She gripped the edge of her station, knuckles white, as she watched Marjorie receive congratulations from fellow contestants. As the competition moved into its next phase, Marjorie's initial success had given her a boost. She approached each new challenge with renewed energy and creativity. Her fusion style continued to impress, setting her apart from the other contestants who stuck to more traditional techniques. As the competition progressed, Marjorie found herself in a rhythm she'd never experienced before. Each round brought new challenges, but she approached them with a quiet confidence that surprised even herself. Her hands moved with purpose as she blended spices from India with techniques from Italy, creating dishes that were as beautiful as they were delicious. The judges' faces lit up each time they tasted Marjorie's creations. "Extraordinary," one of them murmured, closing his eyes to savor the flavors. "You've taken us on a journey with this dish." Marjorie's heart swelled with pride. For so long she had dreamed of this moment, of sharing her passion for food with others. Now, standing in this prestigious competition, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Across the kitchen, Lucilia was having a very different experience. Her perfectly executed French dishes, once the talk of the culinary world, seemed to fall flat compared to the exciting new flavors being presented by other contestants, especially Marjorie. Lucilia's frustration grew with each passing round. She found herself glancing more and more frequently at Marjorie's station, her lips pressed into a thin line. The ease with which her former employee moved around the kitchen, the creative flair she displayed, it all served to heighten Lucilia's sense of unease. As the competition entered its final stages, the tension between Marjorie and Lucilia became palpable. They never spoke directly, but their awareness of each other was constant. Marjorie could feel Lucilia's eyes on her as she worked, but she refused to let it shake her focus. For Lucilia, each of Marjorie's successes felt like a personal slight. She threw herself into her cooking with renewed vigor, determined to prove that her traditional methods were still superior. But as she watched the judges' reactions to her dishes, polite nods rather than the enthusiastic responses Marjorie received, doubt began to creep in. The other contestants noticed the unspoken drama unfolding between the two women. Whispers circulated about their shared past, adding an extra layer of intrigue to the already intense competition. Despite the mounting pressure, Marjorie remained centered on her goal. With each dish she prepared, she felt a growing sense of pride in her work. This was more than just a competition now. It was a chance to showcase her unique culinary voice. one that blended cultures and traditions into something entirely new. As the competition entered its most challenging round yet, the air in the kitchen crackled with tension. Marjorie took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the array of ingredients before her. This was her moment to shine, to prove that her unique approach to cooking was more than just a passing trend. With steady hands, Marjorie began to craft her dish. She drew inspiration from her diverse background, blending flavors and techniques from different cultures. As she worked, a story began to unfold on her plate, a tale of resilience, of overcoming adversity, and of finding unity in diversity. The judges watched with keen interest as Marjorie presented her creation. It was a vibrant fusion of colors and textures, a harmonious blend of East and West. As they took their first bites, their eyes widened in surprise and delight. "This is remarkable," one judge exclaimed, his voice filled with awe. "You've managed to create something entirely new while honoring traditional flavors. It's like tasting a journey." Another judge nodded in agreement. "The technical skill here is impressive, but what truly sets this dish apart is the story it tells. I can taste the resilience, the hope, the coming together of different worlds. It's not just food, it's art." Marjorie's heart swelled with pride as she listened to their comments. For the first time since her unfair dismissal, she felt truly validated in her skills and her vision. Across the kitchen, Lucilia's frustration was reaching a boiling point. Her carefully crafted traditional French dish, once her pride and joy, seemed to fall flat in comparison. The judges' polite nods and lukewarm comments cut deep, each word chipping away at her confidence. "It's competent," one judge said hesitantly, tasting Lucilia's offering. "But in a competition that's pushing culinary boundaries, it feels a bit safe." Lucilia's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. She glanced over at Marjorie, who was still basking in the glow of the judge's praise, and felt a surge of resentment. The other contestants couldn't help but notice the growing rivalry between Marjorie and Lucilia. Whispers circulated as they observed Lucilia's barely contained frustration and Marjorie's quiet confidence. "Did you see how Lucilia looked at Marjorie?" one contestant murmured to another. "There's definitely some history there." "I heard they used to work together," another chimed in. "Looks like the student has become the master." As the round came to a close, the contrast between Marjorie and Lucilia couldn't have been more stark. Marjorie stood tall, her face glowing with a sense of accomplishment, while Lucilia seemed to shrink into herself, her once unshakable confidence now visibly rattled. As the competition intensified, the contrast between Marjorie and Lucilia became increasingly apparent. Behind the scenes, away from the watchful eyes of judges and fellow contestants, Lucilia was unraveling. In the privacy of her preparation area, Lucilia's hands shook as she tried to focus on her next dish. Her mind raced with thoughts of Marjorie's success, and the bitter taste of her own failure lingered on her tongue. How could this be happening? How could a mere waitress, someone she had fired, now be outshining her in a professional cooking competition? "This isn't right," Lucilia muttered to herself, her voice trembling with anger and frustration. She glanced over at Marjorie, who was calmly preparing her ingredients, a look of quiet determination on her face. Lucilia's fury bubbled up inside her, threatening to spill over, but beneath the anger, a seed of doubt had taken root. For the first time in her career, Lucilia found herself questioning her own abilities. Had her rigid adherence to traditional techniques become a weakness rather than a strength? Was her unwillingness to adapt holding her back in a rapidly evolving culinary world? These thoughts tormented Lucilia as she struggled to come up with a dish that would impress the judges. Her once steady hands now fumbled with utensils, and her mind, usually laser-focused on the task at hand, kept wandering back to Marjorie's innovative creations. On the other side of the kitchen, Marjorie was in her element. Despite the high-pressure environment, she found strength in the journey that had brought her here. Every setback, every struggle, had led to this moment. She thought of Mrs. Ellis's kindness and the support she had received, using these memories to fuel her creativity and drive. As Marjorie carefully seasoned her dish, she overheard whispers from nearby contestants. "Did you hear? The next round is going to eliminate several people," one of them said in a hushed tone. Only the best will move forward. Marjorie took a deep breath, letting the news sink in. This was a crucial point in the competition. Everything she had worked for was on the line. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, Marjorie felt a surge of determination. She had come too far to give up now. The atmosphere in the kitchen grew tenser as the contestants realized the high stakes of the upcoming round. Some frantically adjusted their dishes, while others second-guessed their choices. But Marjorie remained focused, channeling all her energy into perfecting her creation. As the next challenge was announced, a hush fell over the kitchen. The head judge, a stern-faced woman with piercing eyes, stepped forward. "This round will test not just your skills, but your ability to tell a story through food," she declared. "Create a dish that represents your personal journey as a chef." Marjorie's heart raced with excitement. This was her chance to truly shine. She closed her eyes for a moment, thinking about her life's path, from a humble waitress to standing here in this prestigious competition. When she opened them again, she knew exactly what she wanted to create. With determined focus, Marjorie set to work. She decided to craft a dish that blended Southern soul food with Asian and Latin influences, a perfect representation of her diverse background and experiences. As she cooked, her movements were graceful and purposeful, each ingredient carefully chosen and prepared. Across the kitchen, Lucilia struggled. Her usual confidence had deserted her, leaving her second-guessing every decision. She glanced nervously at Marjorie, watching as the former waitress worked with an assurance that Lucilia herself no longer felt. As time ticked away, Marjorie put the finishing touches on her plate. Her creation was a beautiful fusion of flavors and textures: crispy fried chicken with a spicy gochujang glaze, served over creamy coconut rice and black beans with a zesty mango salsa on the side. The aroma wafting from her station drew appreciative glances from nearby contestants. When it came time for judging, Marjorie presented her dish with pride. "This plate represents my journey," she explained, her voice clear and steady. "It's a blend of the Southern comfort food I grew up with, the Asian flavors I've come to love, and the Latin influences that have inspired me. Just like these diverse elements come together in harmony on this plate, my experiences have shaped me into the chef I am today." The judges tasted her dish, their expressions changing from curiosity to delight. "Marjorie," the head judge said, "this is remarkable. The flavors are bold yet balanced, and the story behind it adds another layer of depth. You've truly outdone yourself." Marjorie beamed with pride, feeling a sense of validation she had never experienced before. She had poured her heart and soul into this dish, and the judges had recognized it. Meanwhile, Lucilia presented her dish last, her hands trembling slightly as she set the plate before the judges. Her creation, while technically sound, lacked the passion and innovation of Marjorie's. The judges' feedback was polite but lukewarm. As the results were announced, Marjorie found herself once again at the top of the pack, while Lucilia barely scraped through to the next round. The contrast between them was stark. Marjorie stood tall, her eyes shining with newfound confidence, while Lucilia seemed to shrink into herself, rattled by her near elimination and Marjorie's continued success. As the competition progressed, Marjorie found herself in a moment of quiet reflection. She stood at her station, carefully wiping down her workspace when a realization washed over her. The journey that had brought her here suddenly came into sharp focus. She thought back to that terrible day when Lucilia had fired her. At the time, it had felt like her world was crumbling. But now, as she stood in this prestigious kitchen, competing against some of the best chefs in the country, she saw that moment in a different light. "It was the push I needed," Marjorie whispered to herself, a small smile playing on her lips. That painful experience had been the catalyst for her to pursue her true passion. If she hadn't been fired, would she have ever found the courage to chase her dreams? As she prepared for the next challenge, Marjorie felt a newfound appreciation for her own strength. She had faced adversity head-on and come out stronger. Her fusion dishes weren't just about blending flavors. They were a testament to her resilience, her ability to take different experiences and create something beautiful from them. Across the kitchen, Lucilia was having a very different experience. As she struggled to keep up with the innovative approaches of her competitors, especially Marjorie, she felt herself beginning to falter. Her hands, usually so steady and sure, now trembled slightly as she worked. Lucilia glanced over at Marjorie, watching as her former employee moved with confidence and grace. A knot formed in her stomach as she realized that Marjorie's success was highlighting her own shortcomings. The possibility that she might not win the competition, something she had taken for granted at the start, now loomed large in her mind. As she worked, Lucilia found herself replaying the day she had fired Marjorie. At the time, it had seemed like the right decision, a way to assert her authority. But now, seeing Marjorie's talent and passion on full display, doubt crept in. Had she made a terrible mistake? The weight of her past actions pressed down on Lucilia, making each task feel more difficult. She had always prided herself on her skills and her position, but now she wondered if her rigid approach to cooking and to managing her kitchen had held her back. As the day wore on, the contrast between Marjorie and Lucilia became more pronounced. Marjorie moved forward with growing confidence, her eyes bright with excitement for each new challenge. Lucilia, on the other hand, seemed to shrink into herself, her usual commanding presence diminished by self-doubt and regret. As the competition entered its penultimate round, the air in the kitchen crackled with tension. Marjorie and Lucilia stood at their stations, both still in the running, but the pressure was more intense than ever. The challenge this time was to create a dish that told a personal story. Marjorie took a deep breath, her mind racing back to her childhood. She remembered the warm, comforting smells that used to waft from her grandmother's kitchen. With a small smile, she began to gather her ingredients, her hands moving with purpose and love. "I know exactly what I'm going to make," she whispered to herself, her eyes shining with determination. As Marjorie worked, she poured her heart into every step. She blended spices that reminded her of Sunday dinners and carefully prepared vegetables using techniques her mother had taught her. The dish she was creating was more than just food. It was a piece of her history, her family's legacy on a plate. Across the kitchen, Lucilia was having a very different experience. She stared at her ingredients, feeling lost and unsure. Her usual confidence had abandoned her, leaving her struggling to find inspiration. The challenge to create something personal felt foreign to her rigid, traditional approach. "Come on, think," Lucilia muttered, her brow furrowed in frustration. She began to cook, but her movements lacked their usual precision. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, a physical manifestation of her inner turmoil. As the cooking time ticked away, the contrast between the two chefs became increasingly apparent. Marjorie moved with grace and purpose, her face lit up with joy as she crafted her dish. Lucilia, on the other hand, seemed to shrink into herself, her movements mechanical and uninspired. When it came time for judging, Marjorie presented her dish with pride. "This is a fusion of flavors from my childhood," she explained, her voice warm with emotion. "It combines my grandmother's secret spice blend with my mother's favorite vegetables, all prepared using techniques I learned from both of them." The judges took their first bites and their faces lit up. They praised the authenticity of the flavors and the creativity of the presentation. One judge was moved to tears, saying, "This dish doesn't just taste good, it tells a story. We can feel the love and heritage in every bite." Lucilia's turn came next. She presented her dish with noticeably less enthusiasm. "This is a classic French dish," she said, her voice lacking its usual confidence. "I've added a few personal touches." The judges tasted Lucilia's creation, but their reactions were muted. They commented on the technical skill, but noted that the dish lacked heart and innovation. One judge sighed, saying, "It's well executed, but it doesn't tell us anything about you. We were hoping for something more personal." As the judging concluded, the tension between Marjorie and Lucilia was palpable. Marjorie stood tall, buoyed by the positive feedback, while Lucilia seemed to wilt under the weight of the judge's criticism. The two women's eyes met briefly across the kitchen, a moment charged with unspoken emotions. As the judges announced the finalists, Marjorie's heart raced. She held her breath, hoping against hope that her name would be called. When it was, a wave of joy and relief washed over her. She had made it to the final round. Lucilia, on the other hand, barely scraped through. Her name was the last to be called, and the look on her face was a mix of relief and frustration. The once confident chef now seemed uncertain and shaken. The head judge stepped forward. his voice commanding attention. "For the final round," he announced, "you will have 4 hours to create a 3-course meal that represents your journey as a chef. This is your chance to show us who you are through your food." Marjorie's mind immediately began to whirl with ideas. This challenge seemed tailor-made for her, a chance to showcase not just her skills, but her heart and soul. As she began to plan her menu, Marjorie couldn't help but reflect on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. Just a few months ago, she had been a waitress, dreaming of someday becoming a chef. Now, here she was, competing at the highest level of culinary expertise. She remembered the day Lucilia had fired her, how devastated and humiliated she had felt. But that moment, painful as it was, had been the spark that ignited her true passion. It had pushed her to take risks, to believe in herself, and to pursue her dreams with everything she had. Marjorie felt a deep sense of pride welling up inside her. She had come so far, overcome so much. From her modest kitchen at home to this prestigious competition, she had poured her heart into every dish, every flavor combination. As she began to gather her ingredients, Marjorie knew that the hardest part was still ahead. This final challenge would push her to her limits, testing not just her culinary skills but her creativity and her ability to tell her story through food. But as she tied her apron and took a deep breath, Marjorie felt ready. She had a story to tell, a journey to share, and she was going to do it the best way she knew how, through the language of food. As the final round began, the kitchen buzzed with nervous energy. Marjorie took a deep breath, centering herself before diving into her preparation. She knew this was her moment to shine, to tell her story through food. With steady hands, Marjorie began crafting her 3-course meal. Each dish was carefully planned to represent a chapter in her journey. The appetizer, a delicate fusion of southern cornbread and Asian dumplings, symbolized her humble beginnings and diverse heritage. The main course combined elements of soul food with Mediterranean flavors, representing her growth and the challenges she'd overcome. For dessert, she prepared a unique twist on traditional bread pudding, infusing it with Latin American spices and fruits. As she cooked, Marjorie poured her heart into every detail. She thought of the long nights practicing in her tiny kitchen, the encouragement from Mrs. Ellis, and even the painful memory of being fired by Lucilia. All of it had led her here, and she was determined to make every moment count. Across the kitchen, Lucilia worked with fierce concentration. Her movements were precise, but there was a rigidity to her actions that contrasted sharply with Marjorie's fluid creativity. Lucilia stuck to what she knew best, classic French techniques and flavors. As the clock ticked down, both chefs put the finishing touches on their dishes. Marjorie's hands shook slightly as she plated her final course, but her face glowed with quiet confidence. The judges approached Marjorie's station first. As they tasted each course, their expressions shifted from curiosity to delight to awe. The head judge closed his eyes as he savored the last bite of dessert, a smile playing on his lips. "Marjorie," he said, "this meal is extraordinary. Each dish not only showcases your technical skill, but tells a beautiful story of resilience and cultural unity. The way you've blended diverse flavors is truly innovative. This may be the best we've tasted in the entire competition." Marjorie's heart soared at the praise. She had done it. She had shared her journey through her food, and they understood. Next, the judges moved to Lucilia's station. They tasted her dishes with thoughtful expressions, nodding occasionally. While they acknowledged her technical proficiency, their reactions lacked the enthusiasm they had shown for Marjorie's meal. "A solid effort, Lucilia," the head judge commented. "Your technique is impeccable as always. However, we were hoping to see more innovation, more of your personal story in these dishes." As the judges deliberated, tension filled the air. Marjorie clasped her hands tightly, hardly daring to hope. Finally, the head judge stepped forward. "The winner of this year's competition is Marjorie." The room erupted in applause. Tears of joy streamed down Marjorie's face as she realized the magnitude of her achievement. She had won not just the competition, but a validation of her journey, her passion, and her unique culinary voice. As Marjorie stood on stage, clutching her award, a tidal wave of emotions washed over her. Tears of joy streamed down her face, and her hands trembled slightly as she held the gleaming trophy. The applause from the audience was deafening, but to Marjorie it sounded distant, as if she were in a dream. She looked out at the sea of faces, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. This moment was more than just winning a competition. It was the culmination of her lifelong dream, a validation of her passion and talent. She thought of all the nights she'd spent practicing in her tiny kitchen, the encouragement from Mrs. Ellis, and even the painful memory of being fired by Lucilia. Each step, each struggle had led her to this triumphant moment. As the applause began to die down, Marjorie's eyes found Lucilia in the crowd. The once intimidating head chef stood off to the side, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. Lucilia's rigid posture and clenched fists betrayed the turmoil within her. The stark contrast between Marjorie's joy and Lucilia's despair was palpable, even from across the room. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, Marjorie made her way through the throng of well-wishers. Her heart was full, but there was one more thing she felt compelled to do. She approached Lucilia, who stood alone at the edge of the room, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Lucilia," Marjorie said softly, extending her hand. "I wanted to congratulate you on your efforts. Your dishes were truly impressive." Lucilia's head snapped up, her eyes meeting Marjorie's. For a moment, a flicker of something, perhaps regret or shame, crossed her face. But just as quickly, it was replaced by a hard, bitter expression. Without a word, Lucilia turned on her heel and strode away, leaving Marjorie standing there with her hand still outstretched. The sound of Lucilia's heels clicking against the floor echoed in the now quiet room, a stark reminder of the gulf that still existed between them. Marjorie stood rooted to the spot, her hand slowly falling to her side as she watched Lucilia's retreating figure. The sting of rejection pierced through her moment of triumph, leaving her with a bittersweet taste in her mouth. She had hoped that this competition would bring some kind of resolution between them, but Lucilia's cold dismissal had only deepened the divide. With a heavy sigh, Marjorie gathered her things and made her way out of the venue. The weight of her trophy seemed to increase with each step, a physical reminder of her success that now felt somehow hollow. As she drove home, the city lights blurred past her window, mirroring the jumble of emotions swirling inside her. Arriving at her modest apartment, Marjorie placed the trophy on her kitchen counter. She should have felt elated, but instead, a nagging sense of incompleteness gnawed at her. She sank into her worn couch, her mind replaying the events of the day. Her victory had been sweet, a dream realized against all odds. Yet, Lucilia's cold eyes and bitter expression lingered in her thoughts. Marjorie had hoped that by proving herself, she could somehow make peace with her former boss. But Lucilia's reaction had shattered that hope, leaving Marjorie to question the true value of her achievement. As she sat in the quiet of her apartment, Marjorie's thoughts drifted to the moment she had been fired. The humiliation and pain of that day had driven her to this point, fueling her determination to succeed. But now, with the competition behind her, she wondered if her victory truly mattered in the eyes of the person who had once wronged her. Marjorie's gaze fell on a family photo on her side table. The smiling faces of her loved ones reminded her of all the support she had received along the way. Mrs. Ellis's belief in her, the judge's praise, and the audience's applause all came flooding back. These were the people who truly mattered, she realized. Yet a small part of her couldn't help but yearn for Lucilia's acknowledgement. It wasn't about seeking approval anymore, but rather a hope for mutual respect between two chefs. Marjorie had extended an olive branch only to have it brushed aside. As the night wore on, Marjorie found herself caught between pride in her accomplishments and the lingering shadow of Lucilia's unresolved hostility. She had won the battle in the kitchen, but the war for professional reconciliation seemed far from over. A month after her triumphant victory at the culinary competition, Marjorie stood in the kitchen of her very own restaurant, Fusion Heart. The gleaming stainless steel surfaces and state-of-the-art equipment were a far cry from her modest home kitchen, where she had honed her skills. As she tied her apron, Marjorie took a deep breath, savoring the blend of aromas that filled the air. The scent of simmering spices from her signature curry mingled with the sweet aroma of freshly baked bread, creating a tantalizing perfume that seemed to embody her culinary philosophy. "Ready for our first dinner service?" asked Sam, her sous chef, with an excited grin. Marjorie nodded, a mix of nervousness and anticipation bubbling in her chest. "Let's show them what Fusion Heart is all about," she replied, her voice filled with determination. As the doors opened, a diverse crowd of eager diners flowed in. Marjorie watched from the kitchen window as people from all walks of life took their seats, their excited chatter filling the warm, inviting space she had created. The orders started pouring in, and Marjorie's hands flew into action. She crafted dishes that told stories of cultural unity, a Southern-style gumbo with a hint of Thai lemongrass, tacos filled with Korean-inspired bulgogi, and a dessert that married Italian tiramisu with Japanese matcha. As the night progressed, Marjorie's heart swelled with pride. The dining room buzzed with delight, plates returning empty and compliments flowing back to the kitchen. She saw faces light up with each bite, conversations spark over shared plates, and strangers becoming friends over their mutual love for her innovative creations. In between courses, Marjorie stepped out to greet her patrons. She shared the stories behind her dishes, listening intently as customers related their own experiences and memories triggered by her food. It was more than just a meal. It was a celebration of diversity and the power of food to bring people together. As the last customers left, their faces glowing with satisfaction, Marjorie gathered her team. "Thank you all for tonight," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is just the beginning of something beautiful." Looking around at the now quiet restaurant, Marjorie felt a sense of fulfillment wash over her. Fusion Heart was more than just a business. It was a testament to her journey, her resilience, and her unwavering belief in the unifying power of food. In creating this space, she had not only realized her own dreams, but had also created a place where others could come together, share experiences, and celebrate their differences. As Fusion Heart continued to thrive, word began to spread about Lucilia's struggling restaurant. Once a beacon of traditional French cuisine, now stood quiet most evenings, its tables empty, and its kitchen silent. Lucilia sat alone in her office, surrounded by awards and accolades that now seemed to mock her. She stared at the latest financial report, her eyes burning with unshed tears. The numbers didn't lie. Her business was failing. "It's just a phase," she muttered to herself, trying to summon her usual confidence. But deep down, Lucilia knew it was more than that. Outside, she could hear the excited chatter of people walking by, many heading towards Fusion Heart. The sound of their laughter twisted like a knife in her gut. Lucilia peered out the window, watching as groups of friends and families eagerly made their way to Marjorie's restaurant. With a heavy sigh, Lucilia turned back to her empty dining room. The pristine white tablecloths and polished silverware seemed cold and uninviting now. She ran her hand over a nearby table, remembering the days when getting a reservation here was nearly impossible. As she walked through her kitchen, Lucilia's eyes fell on her team. They moved listlessly, preparing for another slow night. The passion and energy that once filled this space had dimmed, replaced by a sense of resignation. "Chef?" Her sous chef approached hesitantly. "Maybe we could try adding some new dishes to the menu. Something a bit more modern?" Lucilia's first instinct was to snap at him, to defend her traditional methods. But the words died on her lips as she looked at his hopeful face. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. That night, as Lucilia lay in bed, memories of her interactions with Marjorie flooded her mind. She remembered the harsh words she had spoken, the unfair dismissal, and the cold shoulder she had given at the competition. Guilt began to gnaw at her, a feeling she had long pushed aside. "What have I done?" she whispered into the darkness, her voice cracking with emotion. The next evening, Lucilia found herself standing outside Fusion Heart, her heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. She had dressed simply, hoping to blend in with the crowd. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The restaurant was alive with energy. The warm glow of soft lighting illuminated the diverse crowd, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Delicious aromas wafted from the open kitchen, making Lucilia's mouth water despite herself. She slipped into a corner booth, grateful for the semi-privacy it offered. A young waiter approached with a bright smile, handing her a menu. Lucilia's eyes widened as she scanned the dishes. Each one was a creative blend of cuisines, telling a story of cultural harmony through food. As Lucilia observed the room, she couldn't help but notice the joy on people's faces. Families shared large platters, friends clinked glasses in celebration, and couples leaned in close, savoring not just the food but the entire experience. Her gaze drifted to the open kitchen where she spotted Marjorie. The younger woman moved with confidence and grace, directing her team with a gentle authority that Lucilia had never mastered. Marjorie's face lit up as she explained a dish to a curious customer, her passion evident in every gesture. Lucilia's chest tightened with a mixture of admiration and regret. She thought back to the day she had fired Marjorie, remembering the hurt in the young woman's eyes. Now, looking at Marjorie's success, Lucilia felt the full weight of her mistake. As the evening progressed, Lucilia watched group after group leave with satisfied smiles. She overheard snippets of conversation, praise for the innovative menu, appreciation for the welcoming atmosphere, and plans to return soon. A lump formed in Lucilia's throat as she realized what Marjorie had accomplished. This wasn't just a successful restaurant, it was a community. Marjorie had created a place where people from all walks of life could come together, united by their love of good food and warm company. Lucilia's mind drifted to her own restaurant, with its rigid menu and formal atmosphere. She had been so focused on tradition and perfection that she had lost sight of what truly mattered in hospitality, making people feel welcome and bringing them joy through food. Marjorie's eyes scanned the bustling dining room, her heart swelling with pride at the sight of happy customers enjoying their meals. As her gaze swept over the corner tables, she froze. There, tucked away in a dimly lit booth, sat Lucilia. For a moment, Marjorie hesitated. The memory of their last encounter at the competition flashed through her mind. But something in Lucilia's posture, the slump of her shoulders, the way she seemed to shrink into herself, tugged at Marjorie's heart. Taking a deep breath, Marjorie made her way across the room. As she approached, Lucilia looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. "Lucilia," Marjorie said softly, a warm smile on her face. "It's good to see you." Lucilia blinked, clearly taken aback by the kindness in Marjorie's voice. I didn't think you'd want to speak to me," she stammered. Marjorie's smile didn't falter. "Why don't you join me for a meal? I'd love to hear what you think of the food." Lucilia's mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. She looked utterly lost, as if she couldn't comprehend Marjorie's offer. "Please," Marjorie insisted gently, gesturing to an empty chair at her table. "I insist." Slowly, almost reluctantly, Lucilia rose from her seat. She followed Marjorie to the table, her movements stiff and uncertain. As they sat down, Marjorie noticed the tension in Lucilia's face, the way her eyes darted around as if looking for an escape. "I'm so glad you came to visit," Marjorie said, her voice warm and genuine. "What did you think of the menu?" Lucilia's gaze dropped to the table. "It's innovative," she admitted quietly. "I've never seen combinations like that before." Marjorie beamed. "Thank you, that means a lot coming from you." At those words, Lucilia's head snapped up, her eyes meeting Marjorie's. For the first time, the hard edge in Lucilia's expression began to soften. She looked at Marjorie with a mix of confusion and something that might have been admiration. "I don't understand," Lucilia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After everything, how can you be so kind to me?" Marjorie reached across the table, gently placing her hand on Lucilia's. "Because holding on to anger only hurts ourselves, and because I believe everyone deserves a second chance." Tears welled up in Lucilia's eyes, and she quickly blinked them away. But as she looked at Marjorie, a small, tentative smile began to form on her lips. As they sat together, an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Lucilia fidgeted with her napkin, her eyes darting around the restaurant before finally settling on Marjorie's kind face. I owe you an apology," Lucilia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The way I treated you was unforgivable." Marjorie listened quietly, her eyes never leaving Lucilia's face. She could see the pain and regret etched in every line. Lucilia took a shaky breath. "The truth is, I was scared. when I saw how talented you were, how easily you connected with people. It terrified me. I felt threatened. Tears welled up in Lucilia's eyes. I've spent my whole life trying to be the best, to prove myself. But when I saw you in that kitchen creating dishes I could never imagine, I realized how stuck I was, how afraid I was of change. Marjorie reached out, gently placing her hand on Lucilia's. "It's okay to be scared sometimes," she said softly. Lucilia shook her head. "No, it's not okay. Not when it makes you treat people the way I treated you. I was so ashamed of my own insecurities that I lashed out at you. I thought if I could make you feel small, I wouldn't feel so inadequate." As Lucilia spoke, her voice grew stronger. "Watching you succeed in the competition, seeing this beautiful restaurant you've created, it made me realize how wrong I was, how much I've missed out on by being so rigid and afraid." Marjorie squeezed Lucilia's hand. "It's never too late to change, to learn new things." Lucilia looked up, her eyes meeting Marjorie's. "How can you be so kind to me after everything I did?" "Because holding on to anger only hurts ourselves," Marjorie replied, echoing her earlier words. "And because I believe in second chances. We all make mistakes, Lucilia. What matters is how we learn from them." Lucilia nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're an incredible person, Marjorie. I wish I had seen that sooner." As they continued to talk, Lucilia opened up more about her fears and regrets. Marjorie listened with patience and understanding, offering words of encouragement and forgiveness. The conversation flowed easily, the tension between them melting away with each passing moment. For Lucilia, it was a turning point. As she spoke with Marjorie, she began to see the value in change, in embracing new ideas and approaches. She realized that true strength came not from rigid perfection, but from the ability to adapt and grow. And for Marjorie, the conversation was healing. She saw the humanity in Lucilia, the vulnerability behind the harsh exterior. In offering forgiveness, she found a sense of peace and closure she hadn't realized she needed. As the evening progressed, Marjorie and Lucilia found themselves sharing stories and laughing together, the bitterness of the past melting away. The restaurant buzzed with life around them, a testament to Marjorie's success and vision. "You know," Lucilia said, her eyes scanning the diverse crowd, "I never thought I'd say this, but your fusion cuisine is truly remarkable. It brings people together in a way I've never seen before." Marjorie smiled warmly. "That's always been my dream. Food has the power to unite us, to tell our stories. Every dish here is a piece of my journey." Lucilia nodded, a look of admiration in her eyes. "And what a journey it's been. I'm truly sorry I tried to stand in your way." "We all face obstacles," Marjorie replied gently. "What matters is how we overcome them. Your apology means more than you know." As the night wore on, Lucilia found herself opening up about her own struggles. She spoke of her fears of becoming irrelevant, of losing the acclaim she'd worked so hard to achieve. Marjorie listened with empathy, offering words of encouragement. "It's never too late to start again," Marjorie said, her voice filled with sincerity. "Your skills are incredible, Lucilia. Imagine what you could create if you allowed yourself to explore new ideas." Lucilia's eyes lit up with a spark of inspiration. "You really think so?" "I know so," Marjorie affirmed. "The culinary world is always evolving. Your experience combined with a fresh perspective could be amazing." As they parted ways that evening, both women felt a sense of renewal. Marjorie watched Lucilia leave, her heart full of hope for her former boss's future. She turned back to her bustling restaurant, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. In the weeks that followed, Marjorie continued to pour her heart into her restaurant. Each day brought new challenges and joys, and she faced them all with the same resilience and creativity that had brought her this far. Lucilia, inspired by their conversation, began to explore new culinary techniques. She started small, experimenting with fusion dishes in her own kitchen. Slowly but surely, she found herself rediscovering the joy of cooking that had first drawn her to the profession. One sunny afternoon, Lucilia returned to Marjorie's restaurant, This time, she carried a small box in her hands. Marjorie greeted her with a warm smile. "I wanted to show you something," Lucilia said, opening the box to reveal a beautifully crafted dessert. "It's a fusion of traditional French pastry and flavors from my childhood in Spain. I was hoping you might try it." Marjorie's eyes lit up as she tasted the dessert. "Lucilia, this is incredible. The flavors, the textures. It's like nothing I've ever tasted before." Lucilia beamed, a newfound confidence in her stance. "Thank you. I've been practicing, trying new things. It's been liberating." As they shared the dessert, both women felt a sense of completion. Marjorie had found success not just in her culinary skills, but in her ability to forgive and inspire others. Lucilia had discovered that growth and change, while challenging, could lead to beautiful new beginnings. Their story, once marked by conflict, had transformed into one of redemption and friendship. It stood as a testament to the power of perseverance, forgiveness, and the unifying force of food. If you enjoyed the story of Marjorie and Lucilia, I hand-picked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.